Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Heifer International live chat. Today, I am pleased to welcome Esther Park, CEO of Cienega Capital. If you've joined my recent live chat with Sally Calhoun, founder of Piscini's Ranch and the No Regrets Initiative, you may recall that Sally is also the founder of Cienega Capital. So today, I'm thrilled to speak with Esther about impact investing in agriculture and food systems, and why intentionally directing money to the right long-term investment matters as we rebuild our food system beyond COVID. So Esther, welcome and thank you so much for joining me. You've spoken a lot about how investments in local food system often don't address the root causes of the problem in our food and farming. And before we get into the nitty-gritty of what you would like to do with investments and what we've done, I'd like to hear your life story. How have you gotten to this point? Because it's a fascinating journey, which I think the listeners would like to hear.
Sure. So I often refer to myself as the accidental banker. I never intended to get into finance at all from the very beginning. As a young person, I majored in social welfare, actually. I was very interested in social issues and addressing poverty. And things like that. And so that's where kind of I started my journey. And then I had the opportunity to live overseas. I lived in Uzbekistan in the early mid 90s. So this was, shortly after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And this was a place where there was a lot of multilateral donor money coming in. And so I just saw what that was doing in the country, but I also saw sort of a rise of a small business industry in the country. And I thought, well, how can we marry economic development in a way that really drives small business? And so I got interested in microfinance and small business generally. And so I went back to school and I said, okay, how can we think about this? And I ended up working with a community and economic development organization that was focused on low-income communities. And so they said, hey, we love you. We think you're great, but you have no finance skills. So, come work with us and we'll teach you. And it was a great opportunity to do that. So I kind of grew up in the small business and affordable housing arenas. But as we continued to work in that area, I think I started to realize that there were bigger macro issues that were not being addressed by the work that we were doing. So for example, environmental issues. So why were the most number of brownfields in low-income census tracts, right? Yeah. Why were rates of asthma so much higher in those areas? And there were all these environmental issues that were not being addressed by small businesses and affordable housing necessarily. So I started to shift my work into social enterprise, looking at how businesses can be a force for good. So started to look into that arena and quickly got into the food space. At that time, I was mostly working in what we call CPG, consumer packaged goods. So kinds of the things you see packaged on the store shelves in the grocery store, but with a commitment to fair trade and organic practices. And so got introduced to the system of biodynamic agriculture during that time. And then just continued to work in the food and beverage sector, but not really touching agriculture too much. And then I met Sally Calhoun, who you referenced earlier. And she said, I really just want to work with farmers. And I said, okay, I've never done that before, but let's do it. And I was really inspired by her vision around regenerative agriculture. It's the thing that really sort of piqued my interest. And so I just dug in. I dove in really deep, learning as much as I could about agriculture, and then applying the work of financing food and farming enterprises.
Yeah, I think you work for RSF, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So what kind in working with RSF, because that's actually a funder, right? They provide capital, and I think you're probably aware of Guayaquil Yobamate.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was an investor in that, believe it or not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So tell me about the lessons you learned when you were RSF in terms of doing the right thing, in terms of balancing financial requirements and then the impact. And what were you learning?
Yeah, I think when I was there, I was really learning about what it takes to balance those two things
Hmm.
within a social enterprise. Talking with the entrepreneurs, they're having to try to manage really great supply chains. But oftentimes they were getting themselves into trouble because they were trying to provide the financing that those supply chains needed, right? So
Mm,
then,
mm, mm.
they're using up their own working capital to try to help the working capital needs of their suppliers in places like South America or Africa or
Right,
India.
right,
And
right.
so they were putting their own businesses at peril. And so it was, an education process for not just us, but for the entrepreneurs to say, hey, look, what if we try to break this up? Let's try to bring another capital provider to help your suppliers. And that way, your own working capital can be preserved. And sometimes these folks would have very long working capital, so they would pay upfront, right? So in order to help these businesses in particularly developing countries, they would say, okay, well, we'll give you a 50% deposit before you even start making the thing that we're going to buy from you. And so sometimes their working capital cycle would be 9 months or 12 months or even longer. And that would really just strain the business in terms of cash. So that was some work that we really had to do to try to help them understand, well, what's doable within the confines of your own business. But let's also find other ways to help your supply chain so that you're not
Mm.
sinking your business at the same time.
Were you able to find other people to actually provide the capital in the value
In
chain,
some
the supply
cases,
chain?
yes. In
Yeah,
some cases, yes. So particularly in the coffee arena, we found a group called Root Capital, which is based in
sure.
Boston. You may know
Hmm.
of them. Yeah, and there were a couple of other folks like that that were international that we found to help try to find financing, but it was difficult sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think so. Where we're moving towards in terms of doing it right between funding entrepreneurs, and we work with smallholder farmers, as you know,
Hmm.
and we're organizing them into co-ops, which then have a supply chain or set of customers, etc. And the farmers desperately need working capital. I mean, there's
Yeah.
probably several $1 trillion required in terms of elevating the working capital needs or satisfying the working capital needs of farmers all over the world. And we use a technique, we're thinking, and we have actually used a technique of blended capital
Hmm.
in terms of. So, do you see a market for that kind of approach with potential investors that would say, we would like you to provide the first loss, or we can provide the first loss, and so you actually create a blend. Is there appetite for that out there?
There is appetite for that out there. I think that there are some funds that have shown that they can raise philanthropic capital alongside investment capital to cover first loss, or to take extraordinary risk out of the equation for investors in order
Or
to
just
preserve more
absorb the risk,
capital.
right? Or
Yeah,
just absorb the risk. I mean, it's not the risk
absolutely.
is not being taken out; it's being taken out away from the
That's true.
people. It's still.
It's
Well,
still
it's
there.
interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting question, though, Esther, because I think the perception of risk that exists, I think, to me, in the work that we do, is often seemingly exaggerated. I don't know if that's your
Yes.
experience too. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's something that I've said recently, which is that risk is perceived, right?
Hmm.
And so things that we don't know about feel risky to us because we
Yeah.
don't understand them, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's why there's a lot of banks across the country won't touch agricultural lending because they don't understand it. They feel that it's so subject to things like weather, which it is, um, and disease and things that they can't control. And so it feels risky. But as I've gotten to do more work in this sector, I've realized that it's not any more risky than any other kind of,
No.
lending or investing. It's just understanding the risk, and being able to manage for it.
Yeah. I always think to myself, and then when you think about agricultural risk, I said, well, except for the COVID, sort of the craziness that happened, we have food every day, right? So
Yeah.
the production processing goes on, transportation goes on, delivery and distribution, it all goes on. So it's not as risky as people think. Otherwise, we wouldn't be eating.
Right. I mean, we found during the pandemic that this is an essential sector, right? And
Yeah, it
so
is.
none of our portfolio companies closed down.
Yeah,
They're all
that's true.
essential. Yeah.
So I'd love to talk about the real examples. Do you have a specific examples you'd like to talk about, the kind of investments you've made that, from which you're learning, or they're panning out really well, surprisingly or not surprisingly?
Well, I wouldn't say that we have any companies that are doing fantastically well at the moment. These are sort of tough times, but there's a couple of models, I would say, that we've invested in that we feel are very interesting. One is particularly around land access. I think driven by sort of just development prices, farmland has been increasing in value because of just the replacement cost, right? So if you were to develop that land instead of farming that land, that land would be much more expensive. And so it is driving up land prices. So how do we get farmers to be able to access land? And so we've invested in a few models that are looking at how to help farmers access land and in affordable ways. So in some cases, so we have an investment called Dirt Capital. And
I love the name.
They operate particularly in the northeastern area of the US, and they purchase farmland and lease it to farmers with the option for that farmer to buy that farmland in 6 or 9 years. That's a way for the farmer to get on the land, to sort of, go through that initial period where they're maybe converting it to whatever production that they're trying to do there. And then, once they're on their path, say 6 or more years down the road, then they can purchase it with more conventional financing. Whereas
because they've got some cash flow, they've got some proof, they've got,
Exactly. They have history on the land. So those are some things that we're working with. There's another group here in California called California Farm Link. And we're working with them particularly on loans to undocumented farmers. So here in California, we have a pretty substantial farm worker population, many of whom are undocumented. For them, accessing land is also an issue. So this organization helps them to do that.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat box that says, are all your clients, Esther, this is addressed to you, from David Beck, are you all your clients venture capitalists, or are you doing straight loans also? Farmland purchase, one model we're trying to explore is working with land trusts to sell land that's already been preserved so that development value is already gone.
Right. So we do both lending and investing. So we invest across the spectrum, and we call it integrated capital. And in a way, I sort of talk about this tool belt that we have, right? So anything from grants to loans to equity and sort of everything in between, we have available to us. So we usually try to meet the situation for what the capital need is, and then we pull the appropriate tool out. So whether it's a loan or it's an equity investment, we're sort of agnostic in that sense.
Or even a grant.
Even a grant, yes. So we have a sister foundation called the Globe Charter Foundation. So we'll pull from that as well.
Okay. Yeah, we're working with farmers in Mississippi right now on livestock, primarily in the pork value chain. And the problem there, or the challenge there, is that the farmers, African-American farmers, who've been oppressed and it's unbelievable the way they've been treated by the USDA over the years. But anyway, they have land. They actually have land. And the difficulty is the training. Exactly how do you farm, the 10 acres or 20 acres or 50 acres that they have? And how do you deal with that part of the value, the food chain? Because there's a lot of people who would like to farm, but they don't know how to. Right? It's not as simple as people think. It's not a vegetable garden in the backyard.
Right.
Yeah.
So technical assistance is a huge part of what makes farming viable, right? And so we have some, on the granting side, we have made grants to organizations that provide technical assistance to farmers, particularly around business planning, business analytics. So, what kinds of markets are best for them, what kind of product mix is best for them, and how do they understand the mechanics of their business. So There's a group here in California called Kitchen Table Advisors that we support, and they provide free business assistance to small sustainable farmers in Northern California. And then there's another one in the Pacific Northwest through a group called EcoTrust. And they have a similar program that we have funded. So that's an important part of how the financing and the granting can work together.
So, you go ahead, sorry.
No, so I was just going to say that's, like the land access and the ability to start a farm plus, the technical assistance is really required.
One of the key issues that we face when we're overseas primarily is to ascertain and sort of get a real insight on the farmers or the co-ops. Are they actually going to be committed to doing the work that's required? Right? Are they passionate about the work? How do you go about that? Because I think deciding where you put your money against which, because ultimately it's people, right? It's people. Yeah. How do you go about that? What if you have a secret sauce that you'd like to share?
I don't know if it's a secret sauce, but we invest in what we call bright spots, right? And we often use this phrase, can't not do. Right. So we like to find people who can't not do this. It's basically like, are they existentially driven to do this work? Right. Yeah. So those are the kinds of things that we look for. So when I'm talking to an entrepreneur, you can sense their passion and their drive and their committedness, how much of their sort of life is really in this. Right. Yeah. And so that's something that we try to ascertain. It's not, there's no formula to it.
Yeah, no, yeah. I keep searching for a formula. I don't see one either.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I think I mentioned Guayaki earlier on. And I think that was true of that team. They cannot not do it. They could not do it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And of course they built, I don't know if you know, but they have now reached over $100 million in revenue.
Yes, I remember Chris Mann from way back in the day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You probably, I think at the time when you lent that money, it was maybe $2 million in revenue. Now it's well over $100 million. It's incredible how well they've done. Yeah.
Yeah.
So on the farming thing, again, you're looking for entrepreneurs, but are farmers really entrepreneurs, or are they, what are they? Yeah.
Yeah. I like to think of them as entrepreneurs.
You do? Okay.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. I mean, they're running farming enterprises.
Yeah.
And so go ahead.
No, I think they have to love farming, right?
They have to love farming.
Which is hard.
It is hard. And I think, to your earlier point about technical assistance, they love farming, but they may not love the business end of things, right? They may not love the accounting. They may not love the marketing that they have to do, especially if they're direct marketing their products. So, another sort of category of business that we finance and find super interesting right now is this, what we call producer aggregator. So we have a couple of folks in our portfolio who are producers themselves. The two I'm thinking in particular, one is primarily cattle and the other is primarily lamb. And they have their own operation, their own animals, but they also aggregate from, anywhere from 10 to 12 area producers and then sell under their brand, right? Oh. So you have this one outstanding rancher out there who has said, hey, I know how to access markets. I'm relatively good at marketing. And so all these other folks around them don't have to do that themselves, right? Because not every farmer has that ability to do that. And so to the extent that you have these smaller regional aggregators, they can sort of collectively do that on behalf of their regional producers. Mm-hmm. So that's something that we're looking at as well.
Yeah, we've got in Arkansas, we have an aggregator essentially. We've got a co-op form which is called Grassroots Co-op, and we've got several. You know them, of course, with RSF as well, and they're doing very well. The pandemic actually helped their business enormously, interestingly enough. So the aggregators, again, because that requires a lot of working capital, right? I mean, they have to, somebody has to either be paid early or hold on to waiting to get paid. And so you provide capital there too?
Yes. Uh-huh. We've done some loans and some equity.
Yeah. And any aggregation kind of value chain you're talking about, does that include processing as well, or just live animal aggregation?
Well, I mean, they have to process it, but that's done by a third party.
Yeah. So our system actually, we own the processing chain, because it's actually quite profitable. It turns out to be maybe the most profitable part of the chain. Interestingly enough.
Interesting.
Yeah. not by design. It just is because of some interesting components to it. The small processor also processes game. The deer that are at least in a state like Arkansas, there's an awful lot of hunting as well. That kind of thing. There's some comments in the box. I mean, there's a lot of box. Let's see. So one comment from Mayor Ryan: these aggregators are just like Jeffrey Moore's early adopters in crossing the chasm. Those are the farmers willing to think about non-traditional methods. They're certainly out there, but is it tough getting them to take the leap into become aggregators? Or you just find people who just cannot not do it?
Yeah, I mean, we do find the can't not doers, definitely. I'm not trying to convince anybody to be an aggregator.
Okay.
By the time they come to me, they've already decided that's what they're going to do.
Yeah.
Yeah,
interesting. And so the market, I come from the business side of the economy, and so demand is a key variable, right? Ultimately, can you sell? So this movement towards regenerative agriculture, small scale farming, local farming, do you see a continuing future and a development in that market? And
from the consumer point of view?
From the consumer point of view, yeah.
Yes and no. So I feel like in our work, I have felt like the consumers and the producers have been talking past each other. The producers care so much about regenerative agriculture and all of the co-benefits that it brings. And I've just found that beyond kind of your sort of core group of like people who really care about this as consumers, once you step outside of that circle, regenerative agriculture is still very unknown. And it's not clear whether or not consumers really care about that, at least at the outset, to make their first purchase. So interestingly, I'm on the board of the Grass-Fed Alliance, and we commissioned a study, a consumer research study, to just think about, to help us think about how can we message better to consumers about, particularly grass-fed product in this case. And the research came back and said, don't lead with regenerative because people don't know what that means. Don't lead with the environmental benefits because that's not really what people care about. Lead with taste.
Taste. I agree with that. That's exactly what I believe. Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, so that's real. I mean, there's obviously some education that can go on behind like that lead. But we've been leading with the wrong thing, I think, in this industry, which is fascinating.
No, I mean, Grassroots, right? Grassroots, which is an e-commerce operation, when they started moving to taste and also nutritional value, right? All of the components of grass-fed beef has got substantially more in nutritional value in terms of several components of the meat. Sales improved. Yeah, I mean, we are a gustatory species, right? We love good taste, right? Good wine, good food, good steak, and also I got to tell you, there's in my opinion, there's no question that high quality grass-fed beef or pork or chickens is superior. It is superior in taste. It really is. Texture and taste, and So I love to hear this. This is great. This feeds my biases. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so there have been a couple of interesting sustainable fashion companies that I've dealt with in the past, and with sustainable fashion, if you think about it, am I willing to buy this, let's say this shirt?
Right.
The first thing that I'm going to look for is, does it look good? Would I wear this? Right?
Absolutely.
I'm not gonna buy some ugly thing just because it's sustainable.
No,
Right?
that's
Right. So it has to be fashion forward. It has to look good. And then if it has, the sustainability aspect to it, that's a sort of plus, right? That's the cherry on top. And I think similarly with regenerative ag products, whether it's meat or produce, if we lead with taste, like it has to taste good, right? So I'm not going to buy it if it doesn't taste good.
but it's not. I think it's going to not only taste good, it's going to taste better.
It's going to taste better. Yeah.
Better.
Yeah.
That's
right.
a different bar, right? Because I can go to Costco and buy, a New York strip for $10, for 12, 14 ounces, and regenerative beef, it's 24, 25, at least twice the price. And it better be better, huh? Well, it's like
That's
fashion,
right?
right? You talk about fashion, I mean, you can buy a T-shirt out of Costco for $2, and then you can buy a T-shirt online for $64. It better be
Right.
better.
That's
many
right.
ways. Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. I'm so glad thank you for telling us about that research. I think that's critical. A bunch of questions are being asked. All right. So one question which I think is very real in terms, is regenerative agriculture scalable to commercial levels?
It can be. I
Yeah.
think the question is, do we want it to be?
Ah,
And what do we mean by commercial levels, right? So I think that a lot of our investing today is based on the idea of sort of kill it, dominate it, own it, right? So we have these large food conglomerates now, these large multinational food companies who basically own, I don't know, 80% of our food system, right? And so maybe even more. Is that what we want? Do we just want to replicate that system and replace it with regenerative agriculture? I'm not really sure. I'm not sure that that necessarily leads to a more resilient food system, right? Because what have we seen in sort of the hyper efficient, aggregated, consolidated food models, especially with COVID, right? We've seen that kind of system break down. And so for us, we feel like if we're going to build a more resilient food system, we need to be able to get to appropriate scale. So for me, what I deem appropriate scale is what is going to be a large enough scale that will serve the region and maintain the business economics, right? So it doesn't have to be hyper efficient and it doesn't have to be hyper big either. It just needs to be appropriate for the region that it's serving. So there's definitely room for scale because there are a lot of operations that are quite small. And some of our companies, I've even said like, well, let's think about doubling the size. If you were twice the size, what could you do? What could we accomplish here? And how much more stable could this business be? So let's think about that, as opposed to let's think about taking over the entire country with our operation, right? That's never the goal. But the goal is to get to the appropriate scale.
Do you think, in terms of scale, the way we think about it, especially overseas, but also here in the United, but primarily overseas, is the use of collective organizations like co-ops or farmer-owned organization or trusts or whatever the organizing principle is. But that way you can create a lot of the advantage of economies of scale through purchases and transportation and all of the pieces that actually make a system work well, without necessarily giving up the idea of being local, regenerative, even organic, or whatever the appropriate approach is. Do you support that? Or because a lot of work that's being done in regenerative agriculture right now that I can observe, and I may be wrong, tends to be very atomized. Working with a single farmer. Now you talked about aggregators, so that's one way of. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that the co-op model can be quite successful. If you look at somebody like Organic Valley, they're a cooperative and they've been able to scale quite a bit. Now, that said, I will just say that, we were very disappointed to find out that Organic Valley has to ultra pasteurize their milk.
Yeah.
I don't fault them for that. They're a large enough organization where they have to ship milk large distances oftentimes. Right. And so that's a requirement of the scale that they've gotten to. But we've lost something in that process. So, there's give and take. But not to say that every cooperative has to be as large as Organic Valley, right? There are definitely smaller, more regional size cooperatives that exist and can help. The other side to that coin, I would say, is the notion of collectives. So you can collectivize without necessarily being a cooperative,
right?
Which is basically just how do we collaborate as a community of players. So that's
and there are some mechanisms there, and in fact, it's quite common in Africa. They don't form co-ops; they form these collective buying operations or whatever it is, where the most obvious value in being a collective is actually captured. Yeah,
right.
There's lots of questions. Unfortunately, we'll run out of time. But let me ask one more question, if I may.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
So do you think financial investors can help build more local and regional food systems infrastructure? The infrastructure that gets food from fields to plates, warehouses, electrified truck field, processes. If so, what does the investment look like? And can policy play a role in scaling up these investments? That's a very long, broad question. But I think it's about what we've talked about, the systems, right? The system is going to be required to actually be functional.
Yeah. I think so. Just to go to the last part of that question around policy, I mean, I think that can play a role in terms of there's a lot of USDA grant money out there for those kinds of infrastructure operations. So I do think that policy can play a role from that perspective. That said, I do think investors can help build more infrastructure. The problem is that it's usually not the sexy thing that investors want to put money into. And I would say they're probably more suited to debt investments than equity investments, because what would be the exit on an infrastructure investment? So, that's a big question.
But nothing wrong with debt investment, right? I mean,
no, not at all.
No.
In fact, we prefer it.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the return is a little bit more assured. With an equity investment, you're either negative 100% or you're who knows what, and anything in between. Whereas with a debt investment, you're pretty sure what your return is going to be on that investment.
Yeah. We're investing. Actually, we're focusing a lot of our investment on infrastructure. It's not very sexy, but we know that for tomato farmers, for example, in Nigeria, the idea of refrigerated storage is a huge boon to improving, the delivery and the quantity of the crop that's actually sold, that kind of thing. And it's not very sexy, but it sure pays off.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Esther, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it and your perspective. I think it's so good to have people like you out there working the good fight and seeing whether we can improve our system, both from a health point of view and a financial point of view and an ecological point of view, and a community point of view. Well, there's so many points of view. So good. All right. Well, thank you so much,
Pierre.
All right. Be good. And thank you for participating in this.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.